Thank you so much for agreeing to come and be a teacher in our Emory Trial Techniques program. I thought that what I'd do today is to give you a few tips and suggestions about how you can maximize your effectiveness as a teacher and give you an idea of what it is that we have in mind by this program that we run here at Emory Law School. First, let me make sure that you understand that the program is premised on the idea that the students will learn a whole lot better by doing as opposed to by having somebody teach them, talk to them, tell them how to do it. And because the focus then is on their doing, you'll see that most of the time the students are up on their feet and they're performing various exercises, directs, crosses, openings, closings, trying to admit exhibits. And your task is to watch them and to coach them like any good coach would do, whether in a sporting, music situation, or any other kind of situation. The idea is to give them some suggestions as to how to do it better. So the assumptions that we make in this program is that the amount of time that each student is on their feet to give everybody a chance to perform. If you have somewhere between 8 and 10 students in a session in an hour and a half of a workshop, you can tell that they've got about 5 or 6 minutes on their feet. And so time is really short in terms of their performance. We've asked them to prepare the whole examination, the whole opening or closing, but we're going to stop them after about a 5 or 6 minute presentation, and then the folks in the room, the two trainers typically in a room, one being the judge and one being the critiquer, will give them some suggestions and critique as to what they can do next time to do it better. So you won't have a chance to cover everything. What you're going to do is to give each person a tip or two, believing that something's better than nothing, of course, and that their learning will build by experience. Don't be afraid at all of having the students copy each other or copy what it is that they've been told from a situation before. That's the whole idea, is that by watching and looking at each other, the whole group will get better and better and better. Now, you notice with these assumptions that there are some things to watch out for. And the things to watch out for are, perhaps as you come into the KEP program or to any kind of a learning by doing NITA style program, you may have been taught differently than what I'm going to suggest. You may have been taught what I think of as in the more of the boot camp experience. This cartoon, perhaps, is the kind of critique that many of us got in early NITA programs, where you'd stand up and you'd do something, and what you'd get is, this is really bad, Edward. Bad, 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 bad. You don't know what you're doing. Did you ever think about being a dentist? The kinds of quips that some of us have heard over the years. Now, as opposed to then a boot camp experience, how is it that you can provide critique to the students for the purposes of making sure that they're looking at getting better in each performance, and the group gets better and better as we go along? Well, there are a couple of things that I wanted to mention to you. First of all, in watching over the years, folks, well-meaning folks that come in to give critiques, notice some things about what it is that goes on. And maybe you feel the same way that I do, that when you start a session, you're a little intimidated. Here you are, you're in a room full of folks, and they're all looking to you, and you're supposed to be the expert, and it's awfully hard not to be self-conscious and to start to think that it's about you. It's a critique-centered, critiquer-centered approach to the teaching that's going on. The temptation then is to have your comments, when they're centered on you, to be general, to be in the nature of a grade. Well, that was pretty good for the first time. Yeah, you did all right. You know, that was not so good. You know, you don't have any notes, you didn't look very well prepared. The critiques, when they're centered on the person who is teaching, often tend to be too general. They happen to have a lot of what we call the I messages in them. I didn't like the way you did this. I didn't like your presentation style. I don't like the way you wear your hair. The I messages and the personal and judgmental accounts, criticisms about being wrong, are the kinds of critiques we see when the focus is too much on the person who is doing the critiquing as opposed to on the student. It results, I think, very often from a really well-intentioned view that, uh-oh, that was not very good. That was something I sure hope you don't think is going to make it in the real world. And you see that, and you worry about the client and the prospective clients of America, and you see a performance like that, and you worry that, in fact, the folks are taking it too cavalierly, they're not giving the best effort, and they're not rising to the level of competence required in the profession. So I think that often the motivation from the critiquer-centered critique is a kind of a client focus, but when that's combined up with a whole series of judgmental statements about being wrong, it can be devastating to the student. So what we're going to suggest to you is that you leave off the judgments and the personal comments. And for every person that you look at, that you try to ask yourself this question: how can I provide a point or two that will try to make this student better the next time they perform? If your focus can be toward the bench trial that they're going to do, if that's ahead of them, or to their jury trial, and say, well, next time you do that direct, or next time you do that cross, work on this piece of it. This is something to do differently. This is something to do better. Then your critiques are going to be more forward-looking and more centered on them. Critiques that are most helpful in these situations are critiques that are very specific, that have with them a fix that could be implemented by the student immediately once you tell them what you want them to do. It can be anything from the way to work with their notes, how it is to stand, where to use their focus during a direct or cross, how to think about the structure of their questions on a direct examination or a cross-examination. You know, the common kinds of things you look for on direct, the open-ended questions, the head notes and the loopbacks, etc. And on cross, the tight focus of one fact per question, questions that try to leave off the conclusions so you can argue your conclusions for the jury. Those kinds of specific critiques that are tailored to what it is that this particular student needs turn out to be much more helpful. The idea is for you to show them how to do it better next time. The criticism then is offered as a forward-looking motivation for what they can do better to make their game better and to make their job as a trial lawyer better. The focus then is on what you can fix, what it is that you can help this student do better next time. And if you can, pitch it in terms of skills that they're taking forward into their advocacy practice. The pace of their speech, the variation in their tone, the ability to be able to step outside themselves and listen to the way that they're performing and ask whether or not there's something you can do to help them get into touch with who they are, how they are most sincere, how it is that they're most persuasive, and give them suggestions as to how to do that. It requires some energy. It's going to require, as we're going to see in just a minute, that you really pay attention to that student, to be focused on the student, to take notes very specifically about what it is that they're doing. It also requires that what you're doing is taking a look at that individual and saying, in a non-judgmental way, here's what you are doing, let me show you how you can prove what you're doing. So if your mindset can be adjusted to helping that individual student, and by the way, the group as a whole then, because you can bet if one of the persons has that problem, others may have that problem, that what you're doing is you're providing critiques of the performance as opposed to the student, and you're suggesting a couple of things that will help them get better. Now, I have mentioned a couple of times here the idea to be careful that you don't spend more time talking than they perform. And in fact, we'll suggest to you that when you deliver a point of critique, that you deliver a point in about 2 to 3 minutes. If there are 2 of you in the room, even shorter, no more than 2 minutes for a critique. To do that in a way that is most efficient, one way to think about and structure your critiques is that for every critique, the critique should have these features. First, the critiques should have a head note. What it is that you want the student finally to take away. The head note, as you might think of it as point-first advocacy, it's great modeling then for students. The main point that I want to focus on is, how to ask tight, leading questions. Or, I want to talk to you about how you can go back in and get more detail from a witness for how it is that the witness can be more persuasive in the way that they give that detail. And a head note then is an example of putting a framework around your critique so that the critique has a focus. Now, where do you come up with your head note? Well, experienced NETA teachers talk about how the head note is derived from the playback. The playback is that time when you play back to the student where it is that you saw that that student was getting into trouble. And here's a place where if you can ask, you can replicate specifically what that student was saying when they got into trouble. Where was it that they lost their way in that opening statement? Where was it that on that cross they got themselves into trouble? How did they specifically respond to an objection in a way that got them into trouble? That the playback of that is like holding up a mirror or a videotape for them to see what it is that you saw and heard. Now recognize that in most of the NETA sessions there will be in these workshops, there is a video camera that is going on, and you can from time to time tell them to just look at the tape for that part when they go out and they get their video critique. And that can be one way to refer them to the playback that they're going to see and have them evaluate how it is that they got into trouble for themselves. But in the room itself, if what you can do is to read back specifically where they got into trouble, that will make your critique very specific, and it'll show and demonstrate a series of things about your listening to them, paying attention to them, that'll keep you from making it about you again and making it about them. In addition, what I'd like you to do is to think about why you give them the tip that you give. And I'm going to come back to that in just a second and explain the importance of that. But to finish out our four-stage critique, then we have a head note, a playback, a rationale, and a prescription. And those four parts of a critique, you can see, could take a minute or two to deliver, and then provides a specific feedback tip for them to take on in the future. So, for example, if you are doing a head note, playback, prescription, and rationale on a classic problem on a direct examination, the head note might be as follows. I want to talk to you about asking open-ended questions to keep the focus on the witness and the witness's credibility. Now, remember, you asked these questions. Were you the person who was in charge of the Amico Cadiz when it ran aground in England? Were you responsible for making sure that the crew and everybody was kept safe? Was it your job to ensure that you had done what you needed to do to make sure that the grounding of the Amico Cadiz never took place? Were you on board the ship at a particular date and time? Those questions all started with were you, did you, are you, and are starting with verbs and therefore are leading questions. The idea is that you're doing most of the talking during this direct, and so my rationale to you would be that if you want the focus to be on this individual and their experience and their sense of responsibility, you need to fix those questions by asking open-ended questions. Now, how odd, isn't it, for you to ask an open-ended question when you already know the answer? But remember, it's not you who's having this conversation by yourself. It's a conversation for the jury. So flip those questions. What is your name? What is your job? What was your responsibilities as a captain of the Amico Cadiz during the years of 1986-87? Those open-ended questions, who are you? What do you do for a living? How do you do it? What are your responsibilities? Are open-ended questions where the witness will give the answers. And so I'd suggest that next time you try to make each one of your questions start with either who, what, when, where, why, how, describe, or explain. And this is the kind of then format that would in a minute or two give great specific critique to a student on a problem that can help them with their direct examinations. Let me make a couple of comments about what you didn't see from that. First of all, with regard to the head note, what you didn't see is a judgment that says that was an A or that was a B or that was pretty good. The problem with that judgmental start of your critique is that the students are very attuned to comparisons as to who's getting the strokes and who isn't. And if you can think of a room full of students who are like John McEnroe's trying to be very competitive, and you can give every one of those students the same kind of consideration, offering them each the same kind of attention to detail and to the tips, then everybody is in and playing and has a chance for improvement. So if you can keep your head note from being judgmental, and if you can focus your critique on one or two things, it's going to be most helpful. Let me suggest to you that there are a couple of head notes that could be a problem. And listen for yourself during the day when you critique. If you say, I want to talk to you about persuasion, that's probably too broad. And it's going to be too much of a free-flow critique. If you say, I want to talk to you about your organization, again, probably too broad. You want to focus your critique on something more specific so that you can give them something specific. But critiques like, I want to talk to you about how you use your notes. I want to talk to you about where you stand. I want to talk to you about the simple thing of how you introduce yourself to the jury. I want to talk to you about what is a leading question. I want to talk to you about an organizational issue that relates to when you take the exhibit out during an examination. Those are the kinds of head notes which are focusing the critiques and will allow you to make sure that you do something. Now, the head note derives from your playback. And what do I mean by that? Well, as you're taking notes while the student is performing, if you've looked at the problem the night before and you've looked at what it is that you think are the main issues in doing this problem, you have in your head already a pretty good tape of what you're expecting to see. And what you will see then is, from your own preparation of the problem, you'll see that the students are making different choices. And you're asking yourself as you write these things down, and that tape in your own head is going off, you're saying, that's different. Is that good? Is that bad? What is that needs to be improved? And as you write then those notes down on your piece of paper, if you see something that starts to recur, this is a great suggestion to you to make it your head note. And so if as you're taking those notes down, you see bad forms of questions, or no follow-up to what a witness has to say, or no detail, or no ability to move with transitions, or a lack of understanding as to what is an open-ended question as opposed to a leading question, any of those things, that will come from your notes on your playback, and it'll tell you what your head note's going to be. So your head note is derived from the playback that you're taking as you're preparing yourself for the critique. Now, the playback, well, the playback is based on the idea that if you can hold up a good mirror to the student as the student is performing, you will be able to have them discover for themselves what's wrong. If I read back a whole series of questions where the student is being leading on direct, they're going to beat you to the point because they'll discover it for themselves. If I play back for them how they handled the exhibit and how it was that they were all over the place and disorganized with the exhibit, they'll discover for themselves and be hungry for your suggestions as to how to make that better. So the notion of a playback, where you play back for the student what it is that they're doing wrong, is a setup for them to discover for themselves and evaluate for themselves. And finally, that's the principle of learning here, what it is that they want to take away from the situation. And so they may, in their heads, be debating with you. They might say, I think that's pretty good. I did that for a purpose. And as you play it back, they have to reevaluate that. And the more specific you can be on your playback, the more that you can ensure that you're being helpful in your critique. That you're not critiquing something that you want to critique even though it really didn't happen in this case. And that's why your playback is so important. It demonstrates that you're listening and paying attention. And let me just say how rare that is in today's world for people to pay that close attention. And that's why we pay so much money for good golf coaches and good music coaches and good coaching, because they're paying all attention to us. And that's what we're doing here, is we are paying all of our attention and focus on them. And we demonstrate that by being able to, in fact, play back for them very specifically what it is that they were doing. And it demonstrates that listening, and the compliment is not lost on the students. And in fact, it makes them ripe to listen to what you have to say. Again, the more specific that the playback is, the more that you can take notes. And in fact, I'd suggest to you take a pad. That's why I recommend to you that you never walk into a room in one of these workshops without a pad and a pen, ready to take notes on what it is that's going on, so that you can quote back to them what it is that they did as the foundation for them to discover how it is that they can get better. Now, the rationale is key to any good trial advocacy program. The reason the rationale is good is that without the rationale, you see that the tips start to sound like, do it this way and you'll win. Do it like I tell you, take my word for it. And it starts to sound like a set of tricks for lawyers, without any understanding that advocacy is an art as opposed to a science, and that each of us needs to take our own points and our own style into the process. And so the rationale of what works, of the volume in the voice, of the way to use the gestures as the way to structure good persuasion, can be explained as opposed to a take my word for it approach. The students can own it for themselves. What do we know as trial lawyers? We know jurors hold on to conclusions if they discover for themselves, if they hold on to them for themselves. And if what we can do is provide them with an explanation or a rationale that allows a bright Emory law student to say, yeah, I get that, and that will work for me, then they're going to most likely adopt that deeply into their style and into their persuasion. If the rationale is missing, if you can't unpack and explain it, the critique is just not going to be as helpful or effective. And it's an interesting part, an interesting time for you as you think, why do I say that you shouldn't ever ask the conclusion in cross-examination, or you shouldn't ask why on cross? What is it about that question that's too dangerous? Why do I say that? And if you can take the tips and the suggestions and give a rationale for them, then it seems to me you're going to be most effective. Now notice here, there's a temptation in telling the why to tell the war story about why you learned this from something that occurred to you. Do recommend to you to leave the war story out. Tell them that it's your experience. Don't go into the shaggy dog story as to where it is exactly you learned it and how you were still successful, which makes you sound arrogant, or if you learned a lesson the hard way. I guess that's a little bit more humane and more effective. But if you can leave the I learned story that years ago when I was just a lad, and make your experience has taught you that these are the effects on jurors and on listeners to your rationale, that can make it more effective. It makes the point then portable, and what's key here is that, remember, they're never really going to try State versus Mitchell. They're going to do what we know in that exercise, in that workshop, but what we're offering them is a set of skills and principles that presumably they could apply in a variety of settings, some in a trial lawyer setting and some in a non-trial lawyer setting. So our suggestion to you is that the more that you can explain the rationale, what it is about that makes that persuasive in this context to this audience, the more the point becomes portable as a part of their style. It gives the point its context. It makes you focus very specifically on what is the problem here. And notice that if you disagree with each other as teachers, very often the disagreement is about the context in which the problem presents itself. I think sometimes we as teachers have different points of advocacy because we think more typically, how is this going to present itself, and what can I give the student for the more typical situation? The disagreement comes as to whether this situation is really the typical one or whether or not, in fact, it's not. So look at the context of the particular problem to help you understand the rationale you're giving for the technique that you're suggesting. Now, finally, with every great critique, if what you can do is put your money where your mouth is and actually give them some specific questions or ways of doing with things, or showing them what it is that you could say when you're dealing with this exhibit. How, for example, in your prescription with the exhibit, you put the exhibit up and you say, first, Mr. Witness, if you would, please orient us all to what it is that we're looking at here. Describe the exhibit for us, if you would, starting with the top and working your way down. If you can give a prescription that shows them how that problem of working with the witness with the exhibit is something then that really the students love, They always tell us later that the things that they like are the suggestions, the tips that they can adopt and apply and get them over some of the difficulties and problems that they face. And so do a little mini demo. Give them some questions that they could use next time specifically to take care of it. Dealing with prescriptions has a danger because if you get up on your feet and you start to do it yourself, you can have a tendency to take it over. If it doesn't go as well as you had it planned in your mind, then get out of it and laugh at yourself and say it's harder than it looked. But give them a few questions, 4 or 5 questions, a little demo from time to time to show them how they can really take your suggestion and do it and show them how it would work. So the prescription, tell them they'll likely forget, show me they can remember, and then the ideal is if we can get them on their feet doing it themselves. Obviously, that's going to be the best. So, thank you again for coming. I hope these tips you'll find will be useful to you. Remember, keep your points focused, specific, head note, playback, prescription, and rationale. And if you follow these suggestions, I can guarantee you that you will have one of the best thrills of teaching you can, as these students all get better and better and better during the course of the workshops. Thank you again for coming.